Well, protests continue across the country as people react to the fatal arrest of George Floyd. And they are protesting against police brutality and what increasingly is becoming fatal interactions between people of color and police at departments across this country. We're going to dig in a little deeper to the events that have been happening over the past couple of days. I want to bring in Nikole Hannah-Jones. Nikole, you are a reporter for the New York Times Magazine, but you're also the creator of the landmark 1619 Project, which I encourage everyone to sort of dive into. It touches on all sorts of topics that will be illuminating when it comes to the development of this country. But Nikole, let us talk about what is happening right now. And I want to begin with you and your reaction to the president's speech yesterday in the Rose Garden. It was an opportunity maybe for the president to deliver a message of unity. He chose to deliver a message of law and order. And then sort of in the middle of the speech, he referenced the Second Amendment. And I kind of did a little bit of a head shake until I read your Twitter feed. And it gave me a little more context as to why he would mention the Second Amendment in the middle of a speech. Can you talk to that?
Yes, well, according to some historians, one of the reasons that we have the Second Amendment was to allow Southern slaveholders to continue to call up a militia to suppress slave rebellions. At that time, there was a great deal of concern about slave insurrections. There had been, during the Revolutionary period, a lot of enslaved people tried to take advantage of the Revolutionary period and the fighting between Britain and the colonists in order to free themselves. And so there was a fear that they would lose that power if the militia was only nationalized in order to be able to continue to put down those insurrections. So I think the president's call to the Second Amendment, which was kind of oddly thrown into that speech, was signaling to people the right to bear arms, it seemed, against protesters.
And can you give me
Nikole,
your
let's talk
feedback
about
on the speech sort of as a whole? Sorry, Vlad, just kind of your reaction to the speech when you were watching it.
I was appalled. This is a time where we are severely in need of national leadership. I would have expected some empathy with what the protesters are fighting for, and one can ask for order without appearing to be leading an authoritarian regime. The fact that he used the military in the United States to clear out peaceful protesters so that he could stage a photo op in front of a church, I think it sent a terrible message, not just across the country, but to the world.
Nikole, I want to talk about policing in this country. It strikes me as remarkable that even now in 2020, we can get two narratives. You can get officials from the New York Police Department or other police departments across the country telling Americans, look, we've come a long way from where we were 20 or 30 years ago. And then we can get a perspective from somebody like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in his eloquent op-ed in the Los Angeles Times saying that for Black people across this country, going back to Rodney King and before that, they don't see that much of a difference. There's not a lot of daylight between those incidents and where we are in 2020. Give our audience a sense of how policing developed in this country across the South and in the Northeast historically.
Sure. So I think what many people don't understand is modern policing, particularly in the South and, as you said, in certain parts of the Northeast, actually evolved out of the slave patrols. The slave patrols were put in place to deputize white Americans to police enslaved communities, to ensure that enslaved people were only in the places they were allowed, to put down slave insurrections. And these slave patrols had the right to stop and question any Black person, enslaved or free, whom they deemed to be suspicious. We saw laws in the colonies and the states that allowed the execution of enslaved people. It was perfectly legal. If an enslaved person ran away, it was legal to execute an enslaved person. In certain colonies like Virginia and South Carolina, any white person was allowed to kill an enslaved person who was resisting capture. So we have a long history of devaluing Black lives, of allowing white police to kill Black Americans, enslaved people, and then following Reconstruction, even if we're being accused of minor crimes. I know we in this country want to always say that slavery was a long time ago, and what does that have to do with today? But we are, what we see today is a direct lineage from that idea that Black lives are worth less than white lives, that Black people are innately suspicious, and that you have to use violence in order to control this population. When I hear, someone in policing in New York argue that there's no racism in the police department, when just a few years ago, a federal judge found that the New York City was unconstitutionally violating the rights of Black and Latino citizens through stop and frisk. When we know that the FBI actually put out a report raising the alarm that police departments all across this country were being infiltrated by the KKK and other white supremacist groups. The FBI is not some liberal left-wing think tank. It's the FBI. So there's a denial that there are racist elements within police departments, and that there has been almost no accountability. Since 2005, there have only been about 35 officers convicted of killing Americans, even though a black person is killed by the police almost every day in this country.
Nikole, as we've been watching the coverage of the protests across the country, we are seeing peaceful protesters, and then we're also seeing destruction, arson, looting. There is a bit of a raging debate, I think, in this country about how you express dissent and what is the appropriate or inappropriate way to express dissent. The former President Barack Obama has said, that essentially there's no excuse for any forms of violence, in a statement condemning these acts of violence. I want you, because one of the things you offer is a full perspective and context, most importantly, context. When we look at people rioting and looting, and no doubt some of the victims of the looting are going to be businesses that are African-American businesses, how are we to interpret what we see there? The president called people thugs. What is it that we're looking at? And maybe it's not just one thing.
I think, one, we need to be really careful with our language. Yes, it is disturbing to see property being destroyed. It is disturbing to see people taking property from stores. But these are things. And violence is when an agent of the state kneels on a man's neck until all of the life is leached out of his body. Destroying property which can be replaced is not violence. And to put those things, to use the exact same language to describe those two things, I think really it's not moral to do that. So yes, I think any reasonable person would say we shouldn't be destroying other people's property, but these are not reasonable times. These are people who have protested against police violence again and again and again, year after year after year, and still we can have videos of law enforcement with witnesses nonchalantly taking the life of a man for the alleged crime of passing a fake $20 bill. So when we have people who say that people should respect the law, they're not respecting the law because the law is not respecting them. You can't say that regular citizens should play by all of the rules when agents of the state clearly are not. So I think we have to understand where that rage is coming from. There was a spray painted on a building in Minneapolis. Somebody had written, "Do you see us now?" These are people who often suffer invisibly, who have asked for justice again and again and had those cries ignored. And then when we ask ourselves, as media, why are we talking about this all day with back-to-back coverage? It's not because people are out peacefully kneeling in the streets. It's because of the destruction. It's because of the looting. It's because of the conflicts with the police. And I think we all need to ask, if these things weren't happening, would we be paying these issues so much attention? And I don't think we would.
It's a great point that you make, Nikole, and let me lay a deep cut on you here. And this is sort of a deep cut historically speaking, but I really want you to speak to this because you've written about this, and I think it's important for people to understand. You get a lot of people on social media, on cable news, talking about nonviolence and talking about the civil rights movement and talking about and using the words of Dr. Martin Luther King to make their point that is in contrast to what we're seeing today in 2020. When in fact, if people actually knew their history, and I want you to shed some light on that history, the idea of nonviolence was a very different one than sometimes most people, when they think of that movement, whether it's Dr. King or whether it's Gandhi, they really don't have an understanding of what nonviolence meant and how violence was actually a part of that. Can you just explain, when people see the images that they're seeing today and they wonder, why are they doing this? Why are people getting as angry as they are? Can you just give us a little sense of that history?
Yes. So nonviolence was a strategy. And the strategy was actually to use nonviolence to reveal the violence of oppression. And so part of that strategy was to kind of prod white racists into physically harming protesters in order to shame the racists and force white Americans to actually pay attention and care enough about what was happening, particularly in the South, but in other parts of the country. So I think nonviolence in a way is a misnomer, because without that violence, the media didn't pay attention. There's a great book, it's one of my favorite books, it's called The Race Beat, and it won the Pulitzer some years back. And it really shows how Dr. King, for instance, in the Albany, Georgia campaign, when the sheriff there refused to arrest and beat protesters, the media was disinterested. It didn't make national news, and that campaign had to be abandoned. So they had to go into places like Birmingham, where they knew that Bull Connor was going to act in the most egregiously violent ways, just so the media would pay attention and white America would pay attention. So we're comforted by this notion of kind of docile Black people humbly kneeling, of having to be so respectable that you will force white Americans to feel your pain. But this came at a great cost. And what ends up happening, of course, is the civil rights movement leads to this massive civil rights legislation being passed, the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act. And at the same time, urban ghettos all across the North are going up in flames. People are having uprisings. And folks were so confused because there's this huge expansion of Black rights happening, but they aren't doing anything about the living conditions of Black people on the ground in northern cities. And those people realized that nonviolent protest was not going to resolve the issues that they were facing. And frankly, many Black people got tired of just taking beatings and absorbing white violence to get their citizenship. And I don't think we're in a place in America where lots of Black people are willing to do that.
You're such an important voice on this subject, Nikole, and obviously you can tell Anne-Marie and I could have a discussion with you over the course of an hour to talk about this. Including, maybe I'll just ask you briefly before we go out of this, because it's something that I think is important. When we were talking about systemic racism within police departments, some people will say, well, for example, in New York City, the majority of police officers are Black or minorities, and yet we still see this systemic racism. I note that you, on CBS this morning, you said that, of course, not all police officers are racist, but you can be a part of a system that exists that does have systemic racism interspersed throughout it. Can you just briefly explain to our viewers what that means when you've got majority police officers in a country and still be part of an agency that has racist overtones?
Yeah, I think this is part of the issue with how we talk about racism and racial inequality. Is we want to talk about it as just being individuals, but this is systemic. And so Black people who are put over institutions whose job is to police Black communities in a certain way are often going to police Black communities in a certain way, even if they are from that community. So yes, it helps to have a diverse police force, but that doesn't mean that practices, for instance, the whistleblower in the stop and frisk case, one of them was a Black police officer who said, I am being told I have to go out and stop and frisk Black and brown people by my superiors, who are not Black. So that is alone, simply diversifying a police force is not going to mitigate the problem. We need structural reform, and that has to start with actual accountability for rogue police and police actually standing up, because what we hear all the time is it's just a few bad apples, but we are not seeing large numbers of police saying these acts are wrong and we condemn them. So how are we to then determine that large numbers of police are not sanctioning this behavior if they refuse to speak up about it?
Yeah, I mean, that video,
Really?
video of Floyd certainly tells the tale, because there were several other officers there that did nothing, including one that was a person of color. So,
That's right.
yeah, this is the conversation we're having now.
I mean, you saw that video, Anne-Marie. I don't know if you saw that video of that white police officer. I can't remember what city it was in, who pushed over a Black woman and walked away. And you had a Black female officer who followed him and sort of yelled at him. But I can't imagine going to work every day in a police department knowing that you work with an individual like this.
Yeah, and and Nikole can sort of attest to this, that one of the challenges of systemic racism is that it makes an individual's racist behavior sort of disappear. It fades into the system, and so you're not accountable for your own individual actions. That's how systemic racism is able to sort of keep on going, because people can say, but I'm not racist, but,
Yeah, and I think we all have had that experience of being a person of color in a white-dominated institution and have allowed things to happen or not spoken up against something because you are afraid that you will face retaliation because you don't run those institutions. And we see that a lot with police of color. I mean, you look at with Eric Garner, there was initially one police officer who faced punishment, and that was a Black woman.
Right. That's exactly right. Nikole, as always, we thank you so much for taking time to spend some time with us and our viewers here at CBS News. We appreciate it as always. Thank you, Nikole Hannah-Jones.
Thank you.